You fool! Warren is dead.
Welcome once more to HorrorBabble. Peter Van Melsen returns today in case number 11, An Appetite for Steam. In the story, our intrepid PI finds himself up against a novel threat aboard a North Yorkshire steam train. See the video description below for a link to the Van Melsen playlist. Steam Train Visuals by Duncan Kay. We hope you enjoy this one, folks. An Appetite for Steam by Ian Gordon. 1. The smoke of a cigarette blended with clouds of steam pumped from the narrow chimney of a vintage locomotive. One could imagine all kinds of things residing in those fumes, liberated phantoms leaping and climbing, captive shadows plotting and scheming, bountiful images, a banquet for the onlooker. In this case, the onlooker and smoker was the renowned paranormal investigator Peter Van Melsen, enjoying his last couple of puffs before embarking on the journey ahead of him. The investigator had arrived in the North Yorkshire market town of Pickering the night before, spending a quiet evening in the company of two other guests at the Golden Age Inn on Burgate, 2 streets over from Pickering Station, off the main thoroughfare, Market Place. Van Melsen was no stranger to Pickering, the town being a short hop from his home in the quiet village of Rosedale. Visitors on a Monday morning might just catch sight of a tall figure in black, roaming the stalls of the hidden market, or spotting for grayling in Pickering Beck by the ropery. He wasn't one for shopping in major cities, unless of course he was on the hunt for obscure literature. Pickering was one of several spots in which the investigator felt at home, surrounded by familiar faces and creature comforts. And most importantly, in Pickering, he knew where to find a good cup of tea, and where to shop for rare antiques and other treasures. But today's journey would take him beyond the market town to the seaside town of Whitby, for he was taking the train via the North Yorkshire Moors Railway, a spectacular line that winds its way through a beautiful national park, traversing heather-crowned hills and glacier-carved valleys, all seen from the comfort of a traditional Pullman carriage. It was 11:55 a.m., November 3rd, meaning the train Van Melsen was about to board was the last of the season, the current operational period having commenced in March. He often booked himself a seat on this final train, preferring the autumnal scenery to that of spring or summer, and favouring that exciting sensation of being among the very last of the year to make the journey. And though he always enjoyed his time in Whitby, it was time spent on the old train he looked forward to the most. Time to think, to sit in silent contemplation and reflect on recent experiences, both good and bad. The solutions to life's most difficult challenges, he felt, could always be found in the ordered mind of a thoughtful person. Though it was chilly out, the sun was shining, its rays penetrating the steam that was now positively billowing from the locomotive. The image of the train on the platform, its jet-black smoke-box door, a vast, featureless face, its wheels and pistons filled with silent promise, was a sight to behold that morning, inspiring the exhilarated cries of children and the zealous snap-snapping of tourists' cameras. And the station itself only heightened that sense of excitement, the dramatic and recently renovated engine shed framing the train and its waiting passengers like a valuable painting. But Van Melsen was oblivious to all that, as he extinguished his cigarette and climbed aboard. At the north end of the platform, in the lee of the locomotive, hovered a figure almost entirely obscured by the dancing wreaths of vapour that pirouetted there. This person had been there for some time, seemingly caught in the swirling masses like air trapped in a bubble, observing the comings and goings of passengers and crew members alike. Few saw this individual, and those that did merely smiled or mouthed a polite hello, for there was nothing unusual about the would-be passenger, nothing out of the ordinary, just another member of the public waiting to board. But looks can be deceiving, as the individual's later actions would attest, and, as the station master issued the last call for boarding, the unassuming man emerged from his cloud of concealment and stepped onto the train. At 12 p.m. on the dot, the train, lovingly named Elizabeth, sporting the wildly termed blood and custard livery, or in simpler terms red and yellow, set off with an almighty outpouring of vapour, as the unseen fireman filled the belly of the locomotive with shovelful after shovelful of coal. The unmistakable whistle reached the ears of all aboard, as well as those without, traversing the bustling streets of Pickering. The sun continued to shine, and all was well with the world, as the train pulled away from the station, beginning its winding 24-mile trek through the North York moors. At the back of the train, in the fifth of 5 carriages, Van Melsen procured a vacant seat, a forward-facing table seat, providing him with a space in which to write, should he feel the inclination to do so. Further undesignated seating could be found in carriages 4 and 3, with carriage 2 serving as the dining car, with toilet facilities, and carriage 1 accommodating first-class passengers, of which there were none on this particular journey. As the investigator removed his coat and absently rummaged through his satchel, several wandering passengers sought seats in his vicinity. Bags were stowed in overhead compartments, and instructions were given to capricious children. One such child, a boy of 6 or 7, locked eyes with Van Melsen momentarily, during which the investigator nodded in the boy's direction, offering a strained smile. The boy returned a mischievous grin, before being checked by his rosy-cheeked father. The commotion continued for several minutes, as the train began to build momentum. The investigator noted that many seats were vacant, which was typical in his experience and somewhat pleasing, as it meant that he was unlikely to be joined at the cosy table. Not that he was against such company. Companionship was often part of the experience, but he could be assured that for a little while at least, his only companions would be his own pensive thoughts. The graceful chug-chug of the train dulled Van Melsen's senses. He watched the scenery whipping by outside, the sun-kissed autumnal grass, and the muted notes of lowland spruce, larch, and pine. Yorkshire was his home, had been for the longest time, since trading the south for the north many decades earlier. His Dutch parents had chosen Oxfordshire all those years ago, having fallen in love with the city of Oxford and the nearby Chilterns. Young Peter had spent his formative years in the Thameside village of Millhampton, a quiet spot close to the Buckinghamshire border, an all but forgotten world that seemed a million miles away to him now, as he gazed towards the heavenly and expansive Dalby Forest. Perhaps he was due a return to his stomping ground, in order to reacquaint himself with those faraway haunts. Bellwood and the little bridge over the nameless brook, the tower on the hill that was like the finger of a petrified giant, the old church whose cellar door was never locked, and number 25 Memorial Way. Well, recollections of her were for another journey. Van Melsen's thoughts always wandered on the train. Daydreaming was permitted. He needn't concern himself with anything in particular, a joyous diversion from the daily grind. Confined to the encompassing seat of a moving train, he was truly present, seeing the future as a closed door, dark and impregnable, and the past a closed window through which only fleeting flashes of yesteryear could be glimpsed. All in all, it was a period of freedom for the investigator, and he was sure to relish it whenever the opportunity came along. Looking at the bright faces of those travelling alongside him, He wondered if they too contemplated such things, looked at the world about them and marveled at its true nature. Perhaps so, perhaps not. Did it really matter? Barely had his reflections begun when Levisham Station appeared on the horizon, and the train began to decelerate. There were several stops along the route: Levisham, Newton Dale, Goathland, and Gromont, the latter high on the moors, affording a 15-minute break, in which passengers were encouraged to disembark and partake in refreshments at the station cafe. Van Melsen, naturally, with the exception of cigarettes, that is, favoured a strong cup of tea above all else, though you might substitute the word tea for coffee if you asked him tomorrow. The platform at Levisham was deserted. To be expected, really, considering it was the last day of operation. Steam quickly enveloped the station, in which once more active imaginations saw strange apparitions parading like puzzled spirits, waning under blue skies. With the sound of the whistle, Van Melsen climbed to his feet and went off in search of the dining car to grab himself a cup of tea and a bite to eat. Something light would suffice, due to the generous full English he'd consumed, courtesy of the Golden Age. He moved through the carriages slowly, his gaunt frame a pillar of sinew, shrink-wrapped in a gaudy waistcoat, drawing the attention of snooping passengers. All kinds were aboard. A pair of teenagers, neck to toe in black overalls, a shiny-faced man manipulating a deck of cards, an elderly lady whose liberal application of makeup had rendered her face a mask, an animated family of 4, engaged in a rather competitive game of I Spy. To those with whom he made eye contact, Van Melsen offered a nod of the head or a raised hand, courtesies that in each instance were returned. Despite the odd, curious look in his direction, the atmosphere aboard the Elizabeth was warm and welcoming. In all the years the investigator had ridden the train, not once had he heard a raised voice or a crossed word. The ambience of the old world filled the carriages, a bygone time in which social etiquette was commonplace and strangers watched each other's backs, an age that now, for the most part, was only partially visible through the past-facing closed window. Van Melsen was well aware that this was a cynical view, but his experiences over the long years had taught him that the world was a dangerous place, full of dangerous people, ghosts and ghouls notwithstanding. Little did he know, as he entered the dining car, admiring the wonderful umber and cream livery adorning the numerous seats, that the steam train Elizabeth was playing host to one of the most dangerous people he would ever encounter. Meanwhile, the unassuming man had established himself in the third carriage. Like the investigator, he had a table seat to himself, and was musing silently, looking about him for a suitable target. His eyes, remarkably grey and cloudy, were as slits as they scanned the faces surrounding him. There was a young woman holding a book, a collection of poems by Emily Bronte, titled "The Night is Darkening Round Me." A small boy and his father, the latter explaining the geology of the whole of Horkham, referencing their proximity to the Great Hollow. An older, motionless couple, front-facing and absent of expression. But none of these were right. No, he'd need to go for a little walk. The man climbed to his feet, his small frame inconspicuous, and made his way along the carriage towards the back of the train, studying the faces of each and every passenger. Entering carriage 5, he went about his unusual business in that same overt manner, inspecting the faces of the passengers there, his eyes like letterboxes. Reaching the vestibule at the very back of the carriage, he glanced through the thin glass of the inner door, and much to his delight, saw a lone figure on the other side, watching the ever-changing scenery through the rear window. Suitable, he thought, opening the door and entering the small space. The figure was a woman in her mid to late 60s, petite, with permed hair and thick round spectacles. She turned to face the new arrival, and offered the stranger a broad, toothy grin. The man returned the gesture, before proceeding with his routine. "English breakfast, with 1 sugar," Van Melsen said to the steward, rubbing his hands with glee. The steward, a youngish chap with a look of carefree wonder about him, poured the requested and pre-brewed beverage into a paper cup and handed it to the investigator, along with a sachet of white sugar. "Can I get you anything else?" the steward asked, to which Van Melsen merely shook his head, offering payment in the form of nickel-plated steel. "Thank you," the investigator said as he retreated. Back through the carriages he went, clutching his tea, observing the front-facing selection of passengers now clearly visible to him. Several individuals, he noted, had moved from their seats, presumably to explore other parts of the train. The family of 4, the practicing magician, and one of the teenagers in black. Van Melsen couldn't help but notice these things. An off-duty investigator is still an investigator. He sees the world through the same eyes, hears with the same ears. It's in the DNA. He entered carriage 4 and immediately saw both the teenager in black and the practicing magician sitting opposite each other at a table seat, the man with the cards dazzling the youngster with his deft fingers. Stepping into carriage 5, Van Melsen noticed a distinct change in the air about him. Was it just the result of his toil through the carriages grasping a hot drink, or was it significantly warmer and more humid than before? He scowled, his inquisitive gaze drawn to the vestibule at the back of the train, where a number of passengers were gathered. Taking a small sip of his piping hot tea, he cautiously approached the group, all the while evaluating the handful of passengers he passed in their seats, 3 of which were fast asleep, another 2 wearing headphones, staring off into space. "What's going on here?" he asked of no one in particular, as he neared the group. "Not sure," said a bald chap in a yellow jumper, turning to face him. "She's just mumbling to herself." "She?" "Yeah," said a young girl in black dungarees, frowning. "Excuse me," Van Melsen pressed, squeezing between the bodies clustered there, his precious cup of tea held above his head like Lady Liberty's torch. Reaching the vestibule, the inner door now propped open by a backpack, the investigator saw for himself the object of their interest. A woman was sitting cross-legged on the floor, rocked gently back and forth by the chug of the train, whispering unintelligibly. "Hello?" Van Melsen addressed her, crouching to make eye contact. "Can you hear me?" "She's unresponsive," muttered a young lady in a tartan shawl, a book of Bronte poems tucked under her arm. "Hasn't said a word." The investigator paid no heed to the obvious observation, instead choosing to listen carefully to the gibberish spilling from the woman's lips, a tall order with the din of the train beneath him. "Can you make out what she's saying?" The question came from the man in the yellow jumper. Van Melsen shook his head, but in reality he could make out what she was saying, at least some of it. The words "obey" and "jump" were the clearest, but he wasn't about to repeat the mutterings aloud. The first rule of a PI's business is to never, under any circumstances, comment on one's findings prior to developing a basic understanding of their cause. And though he'd be the first to admit that he was hardly a stickler for the rules, on this occasion he felt it prudent to keep his mouth shut. Moreover, he was finding it hard to concentrate. By the second it was getting warmer and warmer in the cramped vestibule. Sweat broke out on the foreheads of everybody present. "Jesus, it's hot," moaned the girl in the dungarees, pulling at the bulky straps in an effort to get the denim off her skin. "I know, what the hell?" agreed the bald man, wafting the collar of his jumper agitatedly. "Obey," mumbled the woman on the floor. "Jump." Her face was bright red, like a glowing ruby. She looked as if she was about to explode. "Can you hear me?" Van Melsen tried again, lowering his voice, taking hold of the woman's hand, a hand that felt like a hot water bottle. "Can you hear my voice?" "Yes," the woman finally managed, some semblance of cognition returning to her. "What happened to you?" "Like to see something." Van Melsen frowned. I'm sorry?" "See something." He leaned in closer. "Must jump," she said, her large eyes behind the thick spectacles swollen and bloodshot. And then, without warning, the woman, slave to a sudden burst of energy, clambered to her feet and launched herself at the rear window. A collective gasp followed, as her body was deflected by the thick glass and slumped unconsciously to the floor. A thin stream of blood flowed from the woman's nose, and a bruise the size of a golf ball appeared on her forehead. In response to the commotion, a middle-aged gent claiming to be a doctor rushed in, quickly dispelling the concerns of the passengers by informing them that the woman didn't appear to be seriously injured. Crew members were informed, who promptly arrived at the scene and whisked her off to first class, calling ahead to the station at Goathland to arrange for an ambulance. And so it was that at approximately 12:40 that November afternoon, things took a turn for the weird. It couldn't have gone much better, thought the unassuming man, now watching from a shadowy recess of carriage 5. He saw the looks on the faces of all present, men, women, and children alike, looks of shock and confusion, of, dare he say it, fear. He emulated those expressions, wore the face he was expected to wear, as the untrained crew members carried the woman through the carriage on a cheap-looking gurney. It was with some difficulty that he managed to suppress a chuckle, catching sight of the massive lump on the woman's head and the shattered spectacles lying next to her. But his amusement was short-lived, owing to the presence of the tall man in the garish waistcoat, the fellow with the pointed chin and the slicked-back hair. This individual showed none of the expected expressions. His was a countenance of poise and purpose, as he strolled along the carriage, eyeing everybody in his midst with subtle scrutiny. The unassuming man was vulnerable. His face would be telling, might betray him, and so he didn't wait for Van Melsen to reach him. He chose instead to follow the gurney, not stopping until he was a couple of carriages ahead of the investigator, returning to the position in which he'd first exchanged pleasantries with the man earlier on the journey. And there he'd stay for a while, until his victim was removed from the train. Meanwhile, he'd keep his eye out for another target, perhaps the appealing-looking girl in the black dungarees. The telltale whistle of the train indicated that they were approaching Goathland Station. Van Melsen watched from the window as the honest crew members, with assistance from the passenger/doctor, left the fallen woman, whose name was Mrs. Garland, according to the ticket found on her person, in the care of the station master, who in turn would soon hand her over to the impending paramedics. Two issues swam at the forefront of the investigator's mind. Firstly, what had caused the heat, the overwhelming heat, to dramatically decrease the moment Mrs. Garland knocked herself out? And secondly, what or who had caused Mrs. Garland to fall into her state of delirium? The first issue was considered odd by all who experienced it, but the second not so much, as no one else had even considered such a question, never mind the possibility that a third party might have been involved. Perhaps it was his years of experience, the dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of strange cases he'd investigated over a long career, that signaled the abnormal circumstances surrounding Mrs. Garland's attempt to jump from the train. It was during this period of contemplation, as the train hovered at Goathland Station, that Van Melsen was approached by a nervous-looking young man. Excuse me," came the voice of the youngster, dragging the investigator from his reveries. You're Peter Van Melsen, aren't you?" His eyes wide, Van Melsen returned jocularly, "Guilty." This calmed the young man somewhat, whose habit of repeatedly brushing away the hefty fringe from his eyes was already a source of irritation for the investigator. "How can I help you?" Van Melsen offered. Mumbled the teenager. "Well, there's something weird going on, isn't there?" To this, Van Melsen nodded and managed a weak smile. As previously stated, though not exactly a devotee of the rulebook, he wasn't one to carelessly cast it aside, particularly during the early stages of a potential investigation, but neither was he one to discourage the inquiring minds of young people. "Take a seat," he invited, taking a sip of the still warm sweet tea. "What's your name?" "David," the young man answered, swallowing audibly in the process. "David Neal." "Pleased to make your acquaintance, David. Now tell me," he went on, placing the paper cup on the table between them, "what are your feelings on the matter?" David frowned, like a schoolboy hit with a topic-appropriate question thrown by an overzealous teacher. He slurred, then shuffled in his seat as the whistle of the train indicated they were about to set off again. "I don't know, really, but I think there was someone in there with that woman." "Someone?" Van Melsen repeated. "Yeah, like a force or something. Like the time you went into that old house with the forest ranger in Galloway." "Ah." The investigator nodded approvingly. "You may be right," he agreed, taking a sidelong look at the expansive moorland framed by the large window. "The question, of course, is what sort of force might we be dealing with? Human or unhuman?" The teenager gulped, flicking his black hair aside, his dark features a mask of uncertainty. "Unhuman?" he ventured, unsure as to whether or not the investigator expected an answer. "That remains to be seen," Van Melsen said, and finished the cup of tea. "We'll be arriving at Gromont in approximately 15 minutes. It'll be interesting to see who gets off and who stays on. Until then," he added, prefacing a dismissal, "keep your eyes peeled, David." The teenager nodded, and, understanding that the investigator wished to think on the matter alone, took his leave. And it was because of his brief conversation with the young David Neal that Van Melsen failed to observe the girl in the black dungarees as she passed through the carriage on her way to the dining car. The girl in the dungarees, a Scot by the name of Kaylee Campbell, was hot and bothered. The incident at the back of the train had weighed heavily on her. Never before had she seen such behavior, not even on the Friday night streets of Leeds, where she was currently living and working as a singer-slash-guitarist, doing the pubs, clubs, and corporate events, pursuing the dream of every amateur musician. The train to Whitby was to serve as inspiration, fuel for the creative fire, and that, it would seem, she'd found in abundance, though not quite in the dreamy, melancholic form she'd sought. Melodies were already flooding her brain, dark melodies that were akin to spacious caverns of sound, the muted words impassioned and evocative, violent even. This could be it, she thought, a new direction, a sound that would transcend the mundane, the everyday banality that had previously defined her. This was fresh, edgy, exciting, and crucially, real. Such were her thoughts as she passed through the third carriage, catching the eye once again of the unassuming man who sat in stoical silence, his grey, murky eyes fixed on her like the laser sight of a rifle. "I'll grab a coffee," Kaylee thought, smiling blankly at the small man. "And perhaps a pastry, a Bakewell tart, or better yet, a slice of pumpkin. Perfect this time of year." But first she'd pay a visit to the little girl's room to check on her makeup after the afternoon's excitement. As the girl's diminutive frame slipped out of view, passing into the dining car, the man climbed from his seat, shooting suspicious glances in all directions, careful not to be seen in his imminent pursuit. For now, this was a game of discretion. The disappearing act would come later. Having taken care of her ablutions, Kaylee emerged from the small water closet and ran straight into the short man with the shiny face. "Excuse me," the man blurted apologetically, his hands raised in admission of guilt. "I was miles away." Something about his demeanor puzzled her, despite the friendly facade that glared up at her. "It's okay," Kaylee returned, beaming politely. "It's a bit on the tight side in here." The man laughed, exposing a set of uneven teeth. "You're right there." She couldn't have explained it, but she found the man oddly compelling. He had the air of a performer, an air she knew well, the air of one whose sole purpose was to entertain by any means possible. Though his eyes were dull and cloudy, his face was bright and well sculpted, the shaggy dark hair crowning his head disheveled but enticingly natural. She was about to continue on her way when the man caught her off guard by pulling something colorful from a trouser pocket and asking, "Do you want to see something?" At 1:05 p.m., Van Melsen bumped into Kaylee Campbell in the middle of carriage 4. Anybody who knew her would have said that she was behaving oddly, walking for all intents and purposes like an extra on the set of a George Romero movie. The investigator sensed that something was off, but he just couldn't put his finger on it. She passed him without a word, would have walked straight into him if he hadn't stepped out of the way, and continued in the direction of carriage 5. David Neal, conducting his own variety of investigation, studying Van Melsen's comings and goings from a discreet distance, came out of hiding to discuss what he too thought to be unusual behavior on the part of the girl in the dungarees. "Is there something wrong with her?" was the teenager's question. Van Melsen shook his head. "I think there's something with her," he answered vaguely. Turning, he went after Kaylee, a frowning David hot on his heels. Again, there was a notable humidity in the air, coupled with a subtle warmth that seemed to be trailing the zombie-like girl. Nearby passengers, including the elderly lady with the face full of makeup, now dabbing her cheeks with a handkerchief, seemed to notice the change in ambient temperature, each of them looking to the windows instinctively or wafting their sweaters. The investigator and his would-be apprentice followed Kaylee into carriage 5, where, curiously, she lumbered over to Van Melsen's table seat and sat herself down, gazing out of the window blindly. "Are you in?" the PI whispered to his new co-conspirator, implying a rendezvous with the girl in his seat. David nodded, sweeping slick hair from his sweaty brow. As had been the case with Mrs. Garland, the unlikely pair found Kaylee to be in a sort of hypnotic state, muttering incoherently. Van Melsen dispensed with the wordplay and went directly to the act of listening. Again, certain words were intelligible: obey and climb, and the repeated words of Mrs. Garland, see something, were clearly heard. "You see," Van Melsen began, addressing David, aware now of numerous nosy passengers angling themselves to eavesdrop. "There are signs of mesmerism here." "Mesmerism?" came the mumbled repetition of the bald man in the yellow jumper, listening from a not-so-discreet position at the back of the investigator. "Hypnotism," Van Melsen reluctantly spoke up, drawing the attention of everyone in the carriage. "I think there's a magician aboard. A magician with an agenda." Various outbursts followed this announcement, mostly in the negative. Young David was listening closely now, his gaze fixed on Kaylee, her features like those of a statue. "Like the Wizard of Wakefield," he ventured, referencing another of the PI's well-documented exploits. "Yes," Van Melsen said, nodding, though Freeman was much more extroverted in his execution. The characteristic whistle announced the train's imminent arrival at Gromont, putting a stop to the present conversation. As the locomotive came to a halt, Kaylee repeated the words obey and climb, and was shortly thereafter on her feet, moving towards the carriage door. "Keep your eye on her," the investigator said to David, scanning the faces of those surrounding him. The troubled expressions of the bold man, the lady in the tartan shawl, and the family of four, the two children clinging to their parents like stubborn parasites. David went after Miss Campbell as she mindlessly meandered towards the station gift shop. He was both thrilled and terrified to have been entrusted with this task, despite a fundamental lack of perception as to the nature of what it was that was occurring. For the moment, he dismissed his doubts and followed the mesmerized girl into the gift shop, where somehow she managed to disappear amid the cramped aisles and stacked boxes. "Damn," the boy muttered under his breath. Meanwhile, Van Melsen found himself on the slippery platform, wet with a touch of early afternoon fog that clung to the moors like a cloak. Volleys of steam were expelled by the locomotive as it wound down for the 15-minute break ahead. With careful observation, the investigator gawped at the passengers as they alighted, seeking either the gift shop or the cafe for refreshments. Several crew members eyed him doubtfully, the rumor of an inquisitive private detective aboard the train at the forefront of their minds. And Van Melsen's watchful eye continued its unyielding duty, would have met the gaze of the troublemaker, had his attention not been drawn by the frantic yelling of David Neal and the frightened shouts and gasps spilling forth from the mouths of nervous passengers crossing the platform. Somehow, Kaylee Campbell had scaled the stone wall of the gift shop and was crawling like a spider up the slick slates of the roof. In a matter of seconds, she'd reached the tall chimney at the apex, and now, with arms like grappling hooks, she was working her way to the top of it. Her face was red as the devil's, and from the top of her damp head vapor was emerging, like steam from the train, clearly defined in the backlit fog. With astonishing agility, she attained the very precipice of the single pot atop the chimney, and stood upright like a rod, groping towards the hidden heavens. A fraction of a second before the inevitable happened, Van Melsen heard a voice behind him, a faint grunt, like that of a sorcerer casting a spell, a master issuing a command. The word itself was foreign to him, a word that he would later identify as "taka," meaning now, according to that curious book of spells, La Magie pour les mages. As the whispered word reached Kaylee's ears, she toppled like a felled tree, tumbling from chimney to roof, roof to platform, landing with an appalling thump on the wet ground. Held in a limp hand, plain for all to see, was a crumpled playing card, the Ace of Hearts. Two. Naturally, the remainder of the journey was delayed. An ambulance was requested, and the police were called. Miss Campbell, bruised but breathing, was promptly taken to the hospital at Middlesbrough, while the police conducted their preliminary investigations. The detective in charge, DCI Harold Seed, acquainted with Van Melsen and his work, was quickly dismissive of the concerns of the rail staff regarding the investigator's presence aboard the train. He went so far as to commend the PI for maintaining a level head under what was assuredly an unusual set of circumstances. A conversation followed between the two, in which Van Melsen spoke of the card-handling passenger, noting that the man in question was now missing. "Pulled a disappearing act, eh?" said the DCI, shaking his head suspiciously. "It's the magician's modus operandi," Van Melsen returned, lighting a much-needed cigarette. "D'you think he's our man?" "My gut says so, but I have to admit, Harry, this whole business has me stumped." Seed nodded, his round, mustachioed face betraying nothing of his thoughts on the matter. He'd heard this sort of thing from the PI before. Often, he found, just prior to some inexplicable breakthrough. An hour or so later, with the observant David Neal at his side, and the bald man in the yellow jumper, who'd introduced himself as Gregory Milburn, a lecturer in computer science at Durham University, Van Melsen sat in the comfort of Gromont Station tea room, enjoying a well-earned cup of tea and a big old piece of apple pie. Weary passengers were scattered throughout the cafe, many of them compelled by the curious investigator, hanging on his every word, shaken up by the day's events. Children huddled close to their parents, their every wish for gratuitous treats granted. Most passengers had been questioned with regards to the missing magician, some saying that they'd welcomed a performance, familiar but no less impressive feats of card manipulation. As to whether or not they'd noticed anything suspicious about the man, the answer had been unanimous. No, not really. With the assistance of Ava Fleetwood, the lady in the tartan shawl, whose book of Bronte poems had caught the eye of the magician, Van Melsen had provided a detailed description of the suspect. The pair had delineated the man's unusually cloudy eyes and his remarkably shiny face. According to Ava, he'd been exceptionally smiley, roving about with the cards in his hands, cutting and shuffling them continuously. Had a habit of coming and going, she said. Spent more time on his feet than in his seat. "Where did he go?" Milburn asked, scratching his polished pate. He and several others had seen the playing card in Cayley's hand. "Impossible to answer," Van Melsen replied, playing his own cards close to his chest. "The police will be on the lookout for him now." David watched intently as Van Melsen made his way through the apple pie, eager to issue a barrage of questions, but knowing better than to harass the renowned PI in public. Finally, Gromont station master, Elaine Westnedge, entered the cafe, informing all that the train had been permitted to complete its journey to Whitby, whereafter travel arrangements would be made for the return trip to Pickering. Drinks were swallowed, pies were shoveled, and the tea room was evacuated in short order. Just as before, the small man with the shiny face found refuge in the clouds of steam now filling the platform. He was nothing if not stealthy. He was as water, fast and flowing, clear and impossible to grasp. Only a sudden change in the weather would oust him, a contingency he was adequately prepared for. But he wasn't infallible. There had been a couple of stumbling blocks along the way, but on the whole things were going rather well, he thought. The spectacled senior, piece of cake. The girl in the dungarees, likewise. Shame about the boy, but diamonds are elusive. This was the game, a game he'd played many times before. To what end he played the game, only he knew, and it was apparent, with this blasted investigator in his midst, that the final stages of the game would involve a great deal of improvisation. And once more, signalled by the distinctive whistle, the unassuming man slipped onto the train, unnoticed. It was 4 p.m. when the train started moving again. The whistle held something of melancholy in it this time round, fading into the immediate moorland like a forlorn spirit. Van Melsen had seen the firemen on the platform at Gromont, covered from head to toe in coal, their dejected faces a testament to disappointment. What a way to end the season. 2 injured passengers, a madman on the prowl, and a police investigation. But it could have been worse, might have been, if the PI hadn't been aboard, sticking his nose where it wasn't wanted. And now he was in the dining car, sitting opposite David Neal, having managed to shake off what was rapidly becoming a sizable entourage. He ordered a black coffee, insisting that a steady intake of caffeine would focus his critical faculties. The teenager followed in kind, ignoring the short monologue on the subject of harmful vices the investigator felt inclined to impart. David watched Van Melsen carefully, the latter gazing off into space, deep in thought. The man's face was inscrutable, showing nothing of consternation or bewilderment. He was calm and composed, keenly focused on the problem at hand. After a short while, during which the teenager polished off his medium-sized coffee in an impressive 5 gulps, the investigator leaned forward conspiratorially, inviting the young man to do the same. "There were 2 brothers," he began, his voice low and measured. "Men of Provence, according to the legend, heirs to a great fortune. The elder was the munificent sort, comfortable with the division of the inheritance. But the younger, covetous and greedy, wanted it all for himself. And yet, being too much of a gentleman to simply stab his brother in the back, the younger devised an unusual scheme, which he called the 4 Aces." Van Melsen paused and took a sip of coffee, his eyes drawn to the darkening landscape without. "The game was simple enough," he continued. "He'd take the 4 aces from a regular deck of playing cards and deal them blindly. 1 to a stranger, 1 to a lover, 1 to a child, and the last he kept for himself. And here's the key to the thing. The last card must not be the ace of spades, for the symbolic significance of the cards was important to the young man, and the ace of spades could mean only death. As per the rules, if, at the end of the game, he was in possession of clubs, diamonds, or hearts, he'd cut his brother's throat in his sleep, becoming the de facto beneficiary to his father's fortune. On the other hand, if he was unfortunate enough to acquire the ace of spades, he'd take the dramatic step to end his own life. According to the legend, a former love interest acquired the ace of hearts, and a street urchin was dealt the ace of diamonds. The younger was left with the ace of clubs, meaning that the stranger, whoever that was, received the ace of spades, leaving him free to commit his cowardly crime. With the ace of clubs in his hand, you'd think he'd have murdered his brother with a mace, wouldn't you?" Van Melsen finished with a chuckle, a rasping chuckle, devoid of joy. David, who had been hanging on the investigator's every word, mumbled, "What a strange story," as he pondered the fate of the stranger. "What happened to the stranger?" Van Melsen shrugged. "Who can say? It's just a legend. The real question is, what is the significance of this game in the mind of a magician aboard a seasonal steam train in rural North Yorkshire?" It was at this time that a small boy approached the table at which the 2 sat. This was the same child who had flashed a mischievous grin at the investigator shortly after departure. "Hello," Van Melsen greeted warmly. "Hello," echoed the boy. A moment later, the boy's father appeared, cheeks rosier than ever. "Sorry to bother you," he said, "but Sonny here says he met that magician." "Oh, really?" the investigator said, his eyes wide. Sonny nodded shyly. "Can you tell me about him?" "He was shuffling cards," the boy muttered, pulling on an earlobe. He were dead good with 'em, so I went over and he asked me if I'd like to see something." "A card trick?" Van Melsen prompted, as the boy faltered. "Yeah," Sonny said, marginally reinvigorated. "He put 3 cards on the table and asked me to pick one. I pointed at the one in the middle, but I never saw what it were, 'cause I heard my mum calling me, and I ran off." "And that's all?" "Yeah, didn't see him again." "Thanks, Sonny," the PI said, nodding to his father. The rosy-cheeked man asked, "Does it mean anything?" "I'm not sure," Van Melsen considered, clutching the paper cup. "But I think you can rest assured that his business with Sonny is done." As he waved goodbye to the boy, he became aware of another increase in temperature, another localized surge in humidity. "Can you feel that?" he asked David, who in turn nodded, wafting his sweater. Armed with his beverage, Van Melsen climbed to his feet. "It appears to be on the move," he stated, "and then we're going to follow it." David frowned at this, but dutifully obeyed as the investigator went about his business, rubbing his fingers together above his head and sniffing the air. There was something with them in the dining car, and Van Melsen was determined to get to the bottom of it. Too close for comfort, thought the small man with the shiny face, feeling like a child in a game of hide-and-seek as the pole-like Peter Van Melsen approached his hiding place. This detective, or whoever he was threatening to compromise his work. When had he ever had to put up with such a meddler? Never, that's when. But there was still time, even if that meant taking his work off the train and into Whitby. With amazing dexterity, the man shimmied out of the cramped space beneath the table seat and drifted silently from the dining car and into first class, which, as he knew from earlier explorations, was completely empty, with the exception of the crew member who was now standing watch by the entrance to the locomotive proper. He found himself another cranny, a space into which even the gaunt Van Melsen would struggle to squeeze, and there he would wait until the train reached its ultimate destination. The gloomy train pulled into Whitby station at 4:30 p.m., signalling the end of what had become a less than pleasurable ride. The passengers alighted and were escorted to a waiting coach, which would take those requiring transportation back to Pickering. Van Melsen, of course, declined the invitation, and had a devil of a job talking young David into boarding, who had been keen to accompany his new instructor on the continuing adventure. Van Melsen admired the youngster and determined to make contact with him at a later date, to provide him with a direction in which to head, should his clear desire to pursue a career in paranormal investigation persist. But the career prospects of David Neal were considerations for another day. Right now, Van Melsen had something extremely unusual to deal with. He had formed an idea as to the nature of the man he sought. The shiny-faced magician was an individual whose pedestrian appearance belied the quite astonishing knowledge and abilities that he was privy to. He was a trickster as much as anything else, one who took great pleasure in fooling others, and, it would seem, in convincing them, via hypnotism or some other form of mentalism, to put themselves in harm's way. There had been no fatalities so far, but this was the investigator's first run-in with the man. This was no amateur he was dealing with, and, in all likelihood, the magician had been honing his craft for many years. If Van Melsen were to put an age on him, he'd have guessed somewhere in the region of 35, but the shiny, smiling face of the man, free of lines and of good complexion, could, in reality, put him at a much lower number. Through a system of techniques unknown to the investigator, the lone prankster was capable of putting the slip on not only members of the general public, but also trained professionals such as himself. It was Van Melsen's impression that, somehow, steam itself aided the culprit in the execution of his illusions, as though in possession of a divining power over the substance, or at the very least an ability to employ the vapour as a veil of sorts, a shield of heat and humidity. But these were just wild conjectures. The investigator would need much more to work with in order to develop a concrete working theory. He had a job to do, and that was to follow the impression ahead of him as best he could, the vague suggestion of heat, like an indistinct mirage, gliding along the banks of the Esk, across the majestic swing bridge, and into the heart of Whitby's old town. The man with the shiny face was troubled. Try as he might, he simply couldn't shake the detective in the long black coat. This person seemed to be filled with uncanny instinct. He was of such conviction that there would be no end to the pursuit until either he stopped to confront him or succeeded in slipping away along one of the myriad ginnels and snickelways of the old town. The small man had been here before, many times, walked the streets by day and performed by night. In the not-so-distant past, his was a face that brought joy to children from all over the country, as he stood by the old town hall with his boxes, tables, and props, ready to entertain all who would give him the time of day. But that was before the accident, the event that would forever change him in unimaginable ways. The man with the shiny face didn't like to think about that, for it wasn't really an accident, was it? It was his lust for power, to be the greatest there ever was. He'd wanted to prove that the ancient arts could be seamlessly merged with those of the modern magician. But some ambitions, as he soon came to learn, can bring only disaster. No, he didn't enjoy such thoughts one bit, all risen to the surface because of this figure in his midst, the relentless silhouette that haunted him. Just keep moving, he thought to himself, as the shadows of the dark streets coiled about him. Van Melsen strode forth like an automaton with a single purpose. On to Sandgate he marched, ducking into the narrow Ellaby Lane, as the faint wraith, barely visible in the low-lit avenues, sought to elude him. Church Street was too broad and open, and so the investigator was dragged in and out of dusky alleys, forced to clamber over gates and fences, driving the mass towards the northern end of the old town, where began the infamous 199 steps, up which the sweltering hunter knew he would be required to climb. And up towards the abbey he soared, 2 steps at a time, sweat dripping from his forehead, his coat flapping in the evening breeze that swept down from above. This was Dracula country, and below him, spread out like a memory of yesteryear, lay the innumerable terracotta rooftops of Whitby, divided by the mighty Esk, the North Sea rumbling in the background, urging him onward. For all he cared, the entire world below could be seething with bloodthirsty vampires, and it would make little difference to him as he pounded the grand steps with unyielding resolve. The abbey above, crouched like a skeletal vulture, beckoned him, and soon, in its great shadow, he would come face to face with that which he sought. Surely I can lose him up here, the small man thought, cresting the last step and veering immediately to the left, drifting in among the old stones of the cemetery at St. Mary's Church, moving ever northward to where the sea-facing edge of the graveyard overlooked the Hagalithe, an ancient shelf of stone in the sheer cliff face below. But the time had come to accept that there was no shaking the detective, aged though he clearly was, his face a rocky bluff in itself. Van Melsen was spurred on by something other than cigarettes and caffeine. This was a man who had evidently looked terror in the face countless times, and, like one who overcomes a phobia by repeated exposure, had become immune to it. But therein the magician identified a potential weakness. The detective was unafraid of him, was unaware of the scale of the threat he faced. Could he exploit that fearlessness? At last, he was ready to stand his ground. Anyone standing by the East Pier Lighthouse, or by the Whalebone Arch at West Cliff, looking in the direction of St. Mary's Church, might have been able to make out, under the vanishing light of a clear November evening, 2 figures above the Hagalithe, locked in a theatrical stalemate. One was Peter Van Melsen, the renowned paranormal investigator, and the other was Philip Michael Gabriel, a street magician turned trickster. The two stood in a torturous silence, transfixed by one another, bewildered, fascinated. Neither spoke, just waited, the northerly breeze ruffling the collars of their coats, the grass at their feet, and whistling among the ancient tombstones. They were the only souls in the cemetery, in spite of the abundant monuments, the final resting places of hundreds of forgotten men and women. It was like a Mexican standoff, 2 foes awaiting the first act of aggression. Gabriel drew first. Not a pair of dueling pistols, but a couple of playing cards, one held in each hand, their faces turned down to the ground, barely visible in the grey light of the graveyard. "Do you want to see something?" barked the small man, his nimble fingers twitching. "In your own time," invited the investigator, who drew 2 weapons of his own, a golden pocket lighter and a cigarette. Gabriel simply watched as Van Melsen rolled the thumb wheel, cupped his hands around the dancing flame, and lit the cigarette. The magician grinned, appreciative of the detective's bravado. "The choice is yours," he said, holding his hands out in front of him. "Left or right?" Puffing on the cigarette, the investigator gave the decision but an instant's thought. "Left," he said, blowing smoke into the air. Without hesitation, Gabriel flipped his left hand over, exposing the face of the card residing there. "Diamonds," he muttered, a look of defeat washing over his features, a look quickly concealed by one of cunning. Van Melsen shook his head and smiled. "Seems this is the end for you, my friend." Smirking, the magician flipped over his right hand, revealing the other card. It was the ace of clubs. "No," he said affirmatively. "It's just the beginning." And with those words, catching the investigator completely off guard, Philip Michael Gabriel spun on his heel, mounted the crumbling fence overlooking the sea, and leapt into the air. Van Melsen dropped his cigarette. His jaw fell to the ground, for it wasn't the body of a man that soared into the night sky. It was a cloud of steam in the shape of a man. And just like the smoke from his cigarette, the shape quickly dissipated overhead, blown eastward by a gust of rogue wind. "3. And so, it's with an appetite for steam," wrote Van Melsen in his journal, "that I continue to investigate the whereabouts of the magician Philip Michael Gabriel." In the days that followed the infamous train journey, the investigator learned quite a bit about the former street entertainer. Gabriel, 30 years old, of Gloucester, had performed up and down the country over the years, wowing audiences wherever he went. His specialty was close-up magic, which worked particularly well on the street. Despite being a relatively obscure name on the circuit, he had his admirers. The great illusionist Carlos Romanos and mesmerist Alexander Dubois, the latter having taught a juvenile Gabriel a thing or two about hypnotism. In the latter months of 2014, Gabriel vanished from public view under, and it probably goes without saying, mysterious circumstances. He had no family to speak of, with the exception of an elderly father, who, as curiosity would have it, had once been a driver of steam engines in the Wye Valley. In time, Van Melsen would pay Gabriel Sr. a visit, if for no other reason than to inform him of the strange transition of his son. For how else could the small man's metamorphosis be described? Or was it just another illusion, something he picked up from the great Romanos, perhaps? It was with sadness that a call came in from DCI Seed, who informed Van Melsen of the passing of Gabriel's first victim, Muriel Garland. Garland, a mother of 3 and a grandmother to 7, had passed away as a result of her injuries. The investigator was unsurprised to learn that a playing card had been found on her person, the Ace of Spades. The purpose of the 4 aces in relation to Gabriel remained a puzzle, though Van Melsen suspected the game was simply a convenient and suitably obscure framework for the macabre routine or performance he'd chosen to enact. The threat the game posed to the man himself, if he was playing fair, of course, couldn't be understated. But like the trapezist, the lion tamer, or he who partakes in a bit of Russian roulette, the thrill comes with the risk, does it not? "It's just the beginning," Gabriel had said prior to vanishing into thin air. The idea that their paths might cross again chilled the investigator to the bone, and he was sure they would, for there were reports here and there, accounts of strangeness aboard other steam locomotives, out-of-character behavior, dangerous pranks, dances with death. In the kitchen of his quiet cottage in the equally quiet village of Rosedale, deep in the Howardian hills, Van Melsen placed the kettle on the hob. He popped a couple of tea bags into a large pot and waited for the kettle to boil. When it did, the resulting whistle was that of the Elizabeth, and the steam that poured forth from the spout was that of the vaporous magician, Philip Michael Gabriel.
If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,